abertura da palestra do professor David Harvey, com o tema Economia Política da Urbanização, Acumulação do Capital e Direito à Cidade. São convidados para subir ao palco e tomar assento à mesa nesse instante o professor Silvio Romero de Barros Marques, vice-reitor no exercício da reitoria da Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, e o professor David Harvey, palestrante nesta manhã. Convidada para também tomar assento à mesa, a professora Leal, coordenadora deste evento e do Núcleo de Gestão Urbana e Políticas Públicas da UFPE. E o senhor Artur Renzo, neste ato representando a editora Boitempo. Anunciada nesse momento a palavra da professora Leal.
Bom dia a todos e a todas, amigos, colegas, estudantes, professores da Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, de outras universidades do Estado. A gente agradece muito a presença de vocês aqui e mais ainda por estarmos na presença do professor Harvey, que representa para nossa área de urbanismo, arquitetura e urbanismo, um dos referenciais teóricos mais importantes da leitura sobre o capitalismo. Eu vou passar a palavra para o nosso reitor em exercício, professor Silvio, e em seguida a gente vai ouvir a palavra do professor Harvey.
Professora Sueli, por gentileza, antes de ouvirmos o professor Silvio, gostaríamos de ouvir o senhor Artur Renzo.
Bom, queria agradecer em primeiro lugar a presença de todos, em nome da Boitempo, agradecer em especial à Universidade Federal de Pernambuco e lembrar que a conferência de hoje marca o lançamento desse Para Entender o Capital, livros 2 e 3, é o volume final do guia de leitura do Harvey sobre o capital, e ele chega junto com esse livro 2 do Capital. É uma nova tradução, mas mais do que isso, é a primeira edição feita a partir dos documentos da Mega na Alemanha. Isso é de especial importância no caso desse livro 2 do Capital, porque, como vocês sabem, é um livro que o Marx não chegou a finalizar em vida. O Engels publicou ele postumamente. De forma que o que a gente tem aqui nessa edição é a organização mais completa de todos os manuscritos, documentos, notas, apontamentos, inclusive lacunas que o texto deixa em aberto. E é interessante notar como a leitura do Harvey dá conta disso de maneira quase que intuitiva. Vocês vão ver ele expondo determinado momento do livro 2, ele fala, olha, essa questão faz muito mais sentido se a gente apelar para toda a discussão sobre capital financeiro, sistema de crédito, que acabou ficando para o livro 3, ao passo que ele vai dizer, olha, se a gente for ler o livro 3 ao pé da letra, a gente pode ser induzido a aceitar umas proposições um tanto dogmáticas sobre a natureza das crises, ao que ele nos remete novamente ao livro 2 e ao frágil processo de circulação. Então, o que eu quero dizer é que toda essa leitura mais viva que o Harvey traz para a gente do Capital, dos textos do Capital, eu falei intuitiva, mas na verdade é mais do que isso, é a perspectiva dele como geógrafo urbano, as preocupações que ele tem com a questão urbana que vão orientando essa leitura do Capital. Quer dizer, é o recurso a Marx que vai permitir que ele desenvolva toda uma crítica do positivismo na geografia, mas, ao mesmo tempo, é um recurso a Marx que não se restringe a uma simples aplicação ou mesmo ampliação das categorias do Marx para dar conta da particularidade do geográfico. A leitura que ele faz é rigorosamente imanente ao texto. Inclusive, entrou em conflito com muitas posições mais tradicionais no interior do marxismo. Enfim, o que eu quero dizer é que o que a gente tem aqui hoje, e que é muito raro, é o surgimento de uma nova modalidade de marxismo e de pensamento crítico, que vai recolocar, por exemplo, a questão da cidade no centro dos conflitos de acumulação de capital e de resistências também. Bom, o Harvey está bem animado para falar com vocês. Ele teve um encontro ontem com os militantes do Ocupa Estelita. E, bom, vou passar a palavra, então.
Anunciada nesse instante, senhoras e senhores, a palavra do professor Silvio Romero de Barros Marques.
Muito bom dia a todos e a todas. É um prazer muito grande estar nesta manhã com vocês, representando a Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, em substituição ao nosso reitor, professor Anísio Brasileiro, que se encontra em viagem de trabalho e deverá estar retornando a Recife na próxima quinta-feira. A questão urbana e a acumulação de capital é um assunto recorrente no meio acadêmico. Há pelo menos 50 anos, são discussões, são temas dos grandes institutos, por exemplo, como a École des Hautes Études da Sorbonne, o Instituto de Desenvolvimento Social, e ela rejuvenesce no pensamento atualíssimo do David Harvey. Ela rejuvenesce para que nós possamos entender, principalmente aqueles mais jovens, a relação do capital com a ocupação do espaço urbano, para que a gente possa encontrar respostas para tantas dificuldades que nós temos em relação ao nosso próprio meio, o nosso próprio local de trabalho. Eu agora estou olhando o mar, estou vendo o horizonte, e vocês estão de costas para o mar. Então, eu estou numa posição privilegiada, mas vocês vão ter o privilegiado de estar de frente para o palestrante. Então, essa relação de posição dentro da urbe, que a gente tanto recorre para encontrar meios de satisfazer a tantas militantes e tantos militantes que estão hoje aqui presentes, e a movimentos assim de uma legitimidade enorme, como o movimento Ocupa Estelita, e que eu tive a oportunidade de acompanhar em todas as suas reuniões na prefeitura, fora dela, e acompanhar ainda a ocupação do espaço. Cheguei aqui ao Espaço Arcádia pelo Cais Estelita e imaginei como seria interessante que a gente encontrasse uma solução politicamente correta, mas, ao mesmo tempo, socialmente e urbanística também correta para atender os anseios do nosso povo. Queria dar boas-vindas ao David Harvey, dizer a ele que é uma honra muito grande para mim, apesar de não ser um especialista nessa área, mas como um homem atento, como gestor de uma das maiores universidades do Brasil, me encontro aqui na posição de ouvinte, um ouvinte atento, ansioso por aprender e ter resposta para as tantas questões que nós temos no exercício dessa função. David Harvey, you are welcome.
Neste momento, senhoras e senhores, a formação desta mesa será desfeita para que possa ser dado início à palestra do professor David Harvey. Pedimos ao professor Silvio a gentileza de retornar à plateia.
Bom, antes de passar a palavra para o Harvey, só uma última colocação de ordem prática. Ele vai fazer uma apresentação inicial de cerca de 1 hora, em seguida a gente abre para perguntas do público. Quem estiver interessado pode enviar questões por escrito aqui para a mesa, e em seguida, terminada essa rodada, a gente organiza uma breve sessão de autógrafos aqui na mesa mesmo.
Mais uma vez, anunciada a palavra da professora Sueli Leal.
Bom, eu não falei no começo, para não tomar o tempo, mas eu gostaria de agradecer a comissão organizadora deste evento, que é composta pelas representantes do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Desenvolvimento Urbano, a professora Lúcia Leitão, aqui presente, a professora Norma Lacerda, a professora Virgínia Pontual, representando a ANPUR, Associação Nacional de Pós-Graduação em Urbanismo, Janaína Lima, Daniele Rocha, Fabiano Diniz, Ronaldo Campos, principalmente o meu colega Luiz de la Mora, que tanto nos beneficiou com sua experiência sobre movimentos sociais, elaborando, inclusive, um guia muito interessante sobre a cidade do Recife, seus movimentos de resistência. A Natália Korowski, nome muito... a Jennifer Borges, Enfim, Luana Varejão também, que faz parte do movimento Ocupa Estelita. Todas essas pessoas foram imprescindíveis para que esse evento acontecesse. E, particularmente, a nossa chefe de gabinete do reitor, Solange Coutinho, e Roberta Japiaçu, que está aqui presente, que também foi uma das principais mentoras, né, dessa organização. Então, eu agradeço muito. O Artur já anunciou a leitura do Capital que o professor Harvey faz. É uma prática do nosso curso, da nossa universidade, nas áreas de ciências humanas e sociais aplicadas também, o uso dessa leitura sobre o capitalismo, a partir da expressão da leitura do professor Harvey, desde a condição pós-moderna até os livros mais recentes, como Cidade Rebeldes. E, para não me alongar mais, para deixar vocês usufruírem, né, da palavra do professor, eu termino por aqui e passo para o nosso cerimonial para anunciar o início da conferência.
Para ministrar, então, senhoras e senhores, a palestra com o tema Economia Política da Urbanização, Acumulação do Capital e Direito à Cidade, tem a palavra o professor David Harvey.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I have been here before. It was somewhere around 1973. Of course, this city looks completely different from how it looked in 1973. And in part, what I want to talk about is that transition, why it came about, and what it means. But I thought I would start by trying to explain to you why I am anti-capitalist. I'm not anti-capitalist because I think capitalists are evil, or that the capitalist system is inherently evil. In fact, there are probably as many evil people on the left as there are on the right. I'm not anti-capitalist because I was raised that way. In fact, I was 35 years old before I actually began to read Marx. So much of my academic life was lived in a different theoretical universe. I'm not anti-capitalist because there's something wrong with my genetic constitution. I'm anti-capitalist for very rational and, I think, thoughtful reasons. And the best way I can explain this is to simplify very simply in the following way. Capitalism is always about growth. It has to grow. And historically, we know that it has grown at the rate of 2.25% per year since around 1800. We know that an adequate growth rate is 3%. You only have to look in the newspapers to see that. We know also that if the growth rate goes to zero, then everybody gets very upset and says we have to do something about it. The G20 just met in Australia, and one of their big preoccupations was low global growth. Europe is stagnant. Japan is zero growth. The United States occasionally comes up and then goes down. The main part of the world that has been growing after the crisis of 2007, 2008 have been the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and some others like Turkey. But many of those countries are suffering a reduction in growth, mainly because the China boom has modified very significantly, and all those countries which have flourished on the back of the China trade have gone into some kind of stagnation and recession. We also see the oil price coming down, so countries which are dependent upon high oil price in Latin America, we would say Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, those countries are beginning to experience economic difficulties. So we have a situation in which everybody from the International Monetary Fund to all of the leaders in Australia are saying there is not enough growth. We need to get back to a 3% global growth. And if we don't get there, we're going to be in deep trouble. Now, one of the questions I think we have to ask is, why is it that we live in a world in which perpetual growth is a condition of survival and a condition of reproduction? Why does it have to grow? And there are two answers. One is that the global population is growing, and so we need to grow to keep pace with the global population. And that is one answer. The second answer is, even if global population was not growing and it was completely stationary, we would still need to grow. And the reason is, quite simply, that capital has to grow in order to survive, because it is about profit seeking, and profit always means that there is more at the end of the day than there was at the beginning of the day. Marx explained this in a very simple way as follows: that production capitalists begin the day with a certain amount of money, go into the market and buy means of production and labor power. They put that means of production and labor power to work to make a fresh commodity. They take that commodity into the market and they sell it for the original money plus a profit, or as Marx preferred to call it, a surplus value. There must therefore be more at the end of the day, because you've got to produce the surplus. And the surplus is an expansion. Now, if capitalists were normal people like you and I, we would take the expansion and have a good time with it, spend it, and all the rest of it. But capitalists can't do that because they're in competition with each other. And if I'm in competition with you and you take part of your surplus and invest it in advancing the system, you defeat me. Therefore, I have to reinvest part of the surplus in new equipment, new ways of doing things, and the like. So that, if you like, is the character of a capitalist system, which means that it is perpetually growing, perpetually expanding. Now, the nature of this expansion has a particular mathematical quality. It is exponential, as we say. It is about compound growth. And compound growth is very interesting. It doubles every so often, and then it doubles again. And the famous story of compounding is the story of, which is almost certainly apocryphal, but it tells the story neatly, of the person who invented the game of chess, and a sultan or a king or whoever offered the inventor of the game a reward and said, "Name your reward and you shall have it." And the inventor of chess said, "Put 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard. Then put 2 grains on the second, and then double it each square. And that will be my reward." And the king, not being a mathematician, said, "Great, we'll do that." The trouble is that by the time you get halfway across the board to the 32nd square, the whole global rice supply is required. And it raises a big question of how do you get from the 32nd square to the 64th square when there's no rice to be had and you've used it all up? Well, the only way you can do that is to make a promise about future rice production, in which you say, all right, we don't have the rice now, but we promise you next year's crop. And then the year after that, you have to promise 2 years crop. And then the year after, you have to promise 4 years crop. And you go on, by the time you get to the 64th square, you're almost promising an infinite crop sometime in the future. In other words, you move from a society which is actually using the actual rice which exists to a society which is based on the promise of the rice. Now, when capital was beginning in, say, 1800, it was relatively small. Compounding like this was like being on the first row. You went from 1 grain of rice to 2, to 4, to 8, to 16, to 32. It all looked very feasible. Marx saw this system and in the Communist Manifesto said, the only way capital can survive is by creating the world market. That is, this expansionary process was going to go global. And of course, it did go global. So when Marx was living, this compounding of growth was taken up by the expansion of the United States, the flow of surplus capital from Britain to the United States, the flow of surplus capital to Argentina, to Australia, places like that. And of course, new markets were being opened up through colonialism and imperialism, so that India was turned into a market, China was turned into a market. So even in Marx's day, the system was expanding, but it was expanding geographically, and there was plenty of place to go. There were plenty of populations in the world who were not part of the capitalist system. There were plenty of territories in the world who were not yet absorbed within this dynamic of perpetual growth. And that was the case in the 19th century. But I want to argue that around 1970, things started to look very different. There was a problem. Where could you go? Fortunately, part of the answer was, well, China opened up. The Soviet Union collapsed. India suddenly gets transformed. So from the 1970s onwards, we saw actually this requirement of compounding growth being realized by a process of absorption of large segments of the world economy into the capitalist dynamic. Then came the difficulties from around the year 2000 onwards. And I'll talk more specifically about them in a minute. But what we now see, right from this particular moment, is a problem. How do you keep compound growth going when we are at the equivalent of the chessboard at the 32nd square? Where do we go? We're talking about compound growth now, which is not about the compounding of what was going on in Manchester and Birmingham and a few industrial cities in 1800. We're talking about compounding growth on everything that's going on in Europe and North America, most of what's going on in Latin America and East Asia and South Asia. We're looking at something which is absolutely impossible, unless you do what I suggested with the chess square, which is you make promises about the future, which means that actually you mortgage the future. We don't have a future. Actually, our future is already actually negotiated by the debt. We're going to spend most of our lives paying off the debt as we take on even more debt. So capitalism that's supposed to be about freedom is in fact about a system of domination. which says you are imprisoned in this system, you have nowhere to go. And the environmental consequences are immense, and the social and political consequences are dangerous because, as has often happened in the past, one part of the world decides it is going to actually destroy another part of the world because that's the only way in which they can continue to grow. So this is a dangerous situation because of the perpetual growth requirement and the compounding growth requirement. And it is for that reason that I kind of say, well, we've got to try to invent a society that does not depend on perpetual growth. Now, when I say that, people always say, well, but, you know, you need growth. Well, yes, in certain parts of the world you need growth. But in many parts of the world you don't need more growth. In the United States we don't need more growth. We've had plenty of it. We could remain stationary. And I think it's good that Europe is stationary right now. They think it's a crisis. I think it's great. And then you say, well, maybe we should be building societies like Japan and Europe that have extremely low growth and which accommodate to low growth. The only problem with that is that in the past, it's always been said that the only way we can actually get most of the world out of poverty and deal with major social questions is through growth. That is, redistributing wealth out of growth is a way to solve a lot of the social inequality which exists in the world and a lot of the questions of poverty that exist in the world. Now, I have a problem with that because I'm old enough to remember a situation in the 1950s where I was told that global poverty will be solved and disappear in the next 20 years if only you release the capitalist growth process. I heard the same story in the 1960s. I heard the story all over again in the 1970s. I hear it when the Millennium Goals were set up in 2000. Liberate the market, liberate capitalism, and we will get a solution to a problem. We've done it decade after decade after decade, and actually, what do we see? What we see is the rich have got much, much richer, and the poor have got poorer and poorer and poorer. In other words, we are told that the mechanism to solve the problem is this, but it turns out that it's that mechanism that creates the problem. That capitalism creates poverty. That capitalism creates unemployment. Unemployment is necessary for the perpetuation of capitalism. The greater the reserve army of labor, Marx pointed out, the greater the rate of profit can be. And since capitalists seek profit, they seek the creation of a labor reserve. And that labor reserve should live at the minimum standard, because that is one of the ways in which you keep the aspirations of the employed labor force as low as possible. So this is the logic of the system in which we exist. And it's a logic which I think doesn't actually work and cannot work effectively in the years to come. Now, one of the things that interests me is when you look at the history of this logic of perpetual accumulation, that urbanization has been caught up in that logic. But when Marx was writing, it was a relatively minor issue. But as time went on, capital needed to create new markets, new ways of doing things which kept the perpetual growth going. And while there were examples in the 19th century of turning to urbanization and rapid urbanization to solve the problem of perpetual growth, those examples were fairly small scale. One of my favorite examples, and I wrote actually a whole book about this, was what happened in Paris after 1848. In 1848, there was one of the first mass crises of capitalist development. And a crisis is typically a period of zero growth, but it also is a period in which surpluses of capital and surpluses of labor exist side by side, and there seems to be no way of bringing them back together. Now that's a very irrational system that produces surpluses of capital, surpluses of labor, but can't get them working together. In 1848, there was a crisis of exactly that sort. Massive amounts of surplus capital, unemployment everywhere, and the result was there was an urban revolution in Paris of 1848. And the revolution brought the working class to power for a period of about 6 months, before the bourgeoisie crushed the working class movement and said, no, we can't have that. But then the bourgeoisie couldn't put capital and labor back together again. So in 1852, along came the nephew of the great Napoleon, Louis Bonaparte, and he said, I'll solve the problem. Make me dictator, make me the emperor, and I'll solve the problem. And everybody said, okay, how are you going to solve it? And he had a number of solutions, but one of the big solutions was rebuild Paris. And actually, when you go to Paris right now, you'll see what was done in that period from 1850 to 1870, when Paris was rebuilt by Haussmann, building the boulevards, building the new consumer society, building the department stores, mobilizing fashion, all these kinds of things. So it was an absolute radical transformation in the physical form of the city, but also in the cultural dynamics of the city, which solved the problem. One of the quick things he did when he became emperor was, he said, everybody in the court or associated with the court has to change their uniform. Here is the new uniform design. And immediately, all of the people who were making clothing in Paris were fully employed, making new uniforms for everybody. So this was the kind of thing that Napoleon did, because he knew if he couldn't put capital and labor back to work together, he would not have been an emperor for very long. And that's what he did. And it was an urbanization project that solved the problem. Now, it's interesting that in 1942, in the United States, in the wake of a big depression of the 1930s, the United States was faced with the problem. How do we put capital and labor back together in a productive activity, which is somehow or other going to create full employment and solve this problem of surpluses of capital and surpluses of labor side by side with nowhere to go? There have been some attempts to do so in the 1930s, but they were not very effectual. The big solution, temporary, was, of course, World War II. That put capital back to work, that put labor to work, but labor was not working on things so much. It was off learning to use guns and fight. And in 1942-43, everybody in the United States in a position of political power got very nervous. What will happen after 1945, the war is over? All of these people, soldiers, come back from fighting for freedom, for fighting for a better world. And they find themselves in the United States with mass unemployment. What will they do? What will this workforce do, which is unemployed and which knows how to shoot guns and can actually be a big revolutionary force? So in the 1940s, there was a big fear amongst the bourgeoisie in the United States of a potential revolution in the United States, particularly since the United States was in alliance with, guess who? The communists in Russia, the Soviet Union. This was a very dangerous moment. Well, in 1942, a very interesting article came out in an architectural magazine. And it was about, well, how did Haussmann solve this problem in Paris? And it was an evaluation of how Haussmann had dealt with this. And the article was by a man called Robert Moses. And Robert Moses basically had been trying in the 1930s to rebuild the whole metropolitan region of New York around new highway systems, suburbs, and the like. But he hadn't been able to get very far. But after 1945, basically, this is what got the United States out of the depression conditions of the 1930s. The famous line which has recently been uncovered is this, that the United States, when faced with a depression, built houses and filled them with things as a way of getting out of the depression. And it built the suburbs. Not only did it build the suburbs, but it also rebuilt the national economy. The American South and the American West were not totally integrated into the capitalist dynamic. In 1945, Los Angeles was a very small city. So everything started to go to the American South and the American West. So you had a regional plan, you had a metropolitan plan, and you solved a lot of the difficulties of unemployed labor and unemployed capital. So it was a suburbanization project. It was an urbanization project that allowed capital accumulation to resume in the way it did. Now, this wasn't the only thing that was happening. There was the Cold War military expenditures. There were various other forms of international expansion and so on. But at the heart of the American recovery after 1945 lay an urban process which contributed to the further accumulation of capital. Now, the dynamic of that process went very rapidly from the 1950s, 1960s, and this was one of the highest periods of economic growth in American history, around 4 to 5% per year from 1945 to around 1970. Very dramatic increase, which was entirely based upon this urbanization project. But by the time you get to the end of the 1960s, all sorts of problems are emerging within this. To begin with, it was racially discriminatory, much of what happened. It was unbalanced in terms of class well-being. And as a result of that, you had a series of urban uprisings in the United States at the end of the 1960s, largely over questions of marginalized populations and racial inequality and racial discrimination. So when I arrived in the city of Baltimore in the United States in 1969, I was arriving in a city which a large segment of the center of the city had been burned down the year before, as had Washington, as had something like 150 cities across the United States during the 1960s. There was a distinct pattern during the 1960s in the United States of urban-based rebellions on the part of those groups in the population who were not incorporated into that urbanization process. And those urban rebellions were very, very difficult to control, very difficult to contain. And the federal government, at a certain point, had to take a vast amount of resources and put them to work. But in so doing, this stretched the financial capacities of the United States. And the result was the crisis of the 1970s. Now, in the 1930s, I suggested there was an answer to the problems of capital accumulation. by developing an urbanization project which was in effect demand-led. Now, the demand-led side of it depended theoretically on the writings of somebody like John Maynard Keynes. So from the economic standpoint, it was Keynesian, state interventionist, a lot of state support for the dynamics of this process of suburbanization. Now, the theory of this was very interesting because it said that, in effect, it's not the question of production which should bother us. What should bother us is the question of the demand. Generate the demand and then production will follow suit. That was the theory. Now, it was fascinating to me when I was doing the companions to Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Capital. I was saying, where does Marx talk about such a strategy? It doesn't enter into Volume 1 at all. You will not find it mentioned in Volume 1. In fact, Marx in Volume 1 says, the demand question is irrelevant. I assume everything can be sold and I'm not even going to be bothered with it. I want to talk about how it is that capital produces, not about how it finds a market. Now, this finding of the market is conceptualized by Marx by what he calls a problem of realization of value. So you have the production of value and then the realization of value in the market. The question of realization of value in the market is excluded entirely from Volume 1, but it becomes central in Volume 2. Marx basically says, I'm not interested in production in Volume 2, I'm interested in the problem of how does the goods that capital produced find a market when the market has to be perpetually growing. Remember that. So you've got to find an expansion of the market all of the time. And what Marx does in Volume 2 then is to talk about this. So if you want to understand the logic of what happened after 1945, not only in the United States, but in Europe and the leading capitalist economies, they all turned to demand management. They all turned to Keynes. They were all working on the logic which Marx lays out in Volume 2. And in Volume 2, what Marx emphasizes is this, that if you repress wages, if you bring the wage force into a position of less and less power, then you've got a problem in your market. Who do you sell your product to when large segments of the population are being forced into conditions of impoverishment? Well, you lose your market. So in Volume 2 of Capital, Marx starts to talk about the necessity of actually supporting working class demands, that the capitalists must do that. And of course, this is what Roosevelt began to do in the New Deal in the 1930s, was to support labor demands, to support labor organization. And it was labor demands and labor organization that ensured the incomes which would be able to be spent on the houses when they were built and filled with things. So that logic, which is there in Volume 2, was very powerfully deployed in the period after 1945. But by the time, and this again is a point that Marx makes, by the time you empower labor because you need them as a vibrant part of the market, by the time you do that, you actually are undermining the conditions for the production of profit. Because labor will take more and more of it. Wages will go up, profits will go down. And by the time you get to the end of the 1960s, that was what was happening in the United States and in Europe and other parts of the central parts of the capitalist world. Labor power was strong, political parties were strong, The state had been taken over by, in many instances, by labour movements and labour parties. So the demand is there, plenty of demand. But the capitalists are finding themselves in a situation where their profits are being squeezed because wages are going up. So there is a capitalist counter-revolution in the 1970s, which said we're going to have to discipline labour. We're going to do it any way we possibly can. And one of the ways to do it was to break the significance of the nation state as a container of labour demands and go global. And say we mobilise the global labour force. We go to globalisation. But in order to go to globalisation, you need to empower a certain branch of capital which is highly mobile. And the branch of capital which is highly mobile is money. Money is what I call the butterfly form of capital. It can flit around the world, land anywhere. And if it doesn't like where it is, it can go off somewhere else. Commodities like the caterpillar, it sort of crawls around and gets here, there, and everywhere. Production is the least mobile form of capital. So what you had to do was you had to actually emphasize finance. And people then say, well, why did we financialize so much after the 1970s? It had everything to do with labor control. And in fact, the financial activities in the United States played a crucial role in the deindustrialization of the United States, the deindustrialization of much of Europe, the deindustrialization of almost any place where labor was powerful. And it wasn't only in the advanced capitalist world that you see this. In Mumbai, in India, there was a very powerful union movement in the textile industry. What happened? The textile industry is destroyed in Mumbai by financialization. So that financialization was not just an accident. It was part of a political strategy to destroy the power of labor vis-a-vis capital, so that capital could make high profits again. Now, this is the logic that actually Marx describes in Volume 1 of Capital. So actually, what we see is the logic of Volume 2 deployed after 1945 to 1975. Then the logic of Volume 1 comes into play after 1975 to the present day. But in each case, as Marx says, there's a contradiction, what he calls a contradictory unity between production and realization. When you were doing okay in terms of realization, you were really not doing well from the standpoint of production. From 1975 onwards, capital started to do remarkably well from the standpoint of production. Labor force was increasingly disciplined. The share of wages in national product in almost every country in the world came down. The rate of profit for capital went up. The levels of social inequality went up. The predictions that Marx makes in Volume 1 of Capital, that at the end of a capitalist competitive process, you're going to see the rich getting much, much richer and the poor getting poorer and poorer. What do we see? Well, you only have to read a book by Piketty or somebody and you'll see what we all knew all along, which is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, to the point where, as Piketty says, we're producing a global oligarchy of economic power, which in effect is in a position to dictate the conditions of reproduction of capital on a global basis. But, as Marx points out, when you took this contradictory unity between production and realization, if you're doing well on realization, you're in trouble in production. If you're doing well in production, you've got problems in realization. So in the 1990s, the question came, where is the market? How are we going to sell products when actually the share of labor in national product is going down and down and down? And therefore, market is becoming less and less viable. What are we going to do? Well, one of the things we do is we decide that actually we can jack up the market by releasing credit. So we start to give vast amounts of credit to the low-income populations. You get the credit cards. In the United States, we gave credit to people to buy houses when they had no money, because that's the way the market worked. Now, the housing market is actually very interesting, because financiers provide the money to the developers, but then the financiers provide the money to the people who buy. And in fact, the same financier will sometimes attach lending money to the developer to build condominiums of the sort you see here to a situation where people will automatically be given a finance to buy. This is a perfect circle, and of course it's subject to abuse. And in the United States, it produced an asset bubble, as we call it, in the housing market. And then the crash came, and you could no longer get out of the difficulties by building houses and filling them with things. Unless, and here I think it's very, very interesting, because I think there's almost a law, which I jokingly refer to, which is the law of conservation of asset bubbles in property. Because the crash in 2008 in the United States not only produced a crash in the housing market, it produced a financial crisis, but it also produced a crisis of consumption. Because many people who didn't have any money would actually remortgage. You buy a house for $200,000, even though you had no assets. If the market is going up, you could then actually sell it for $300,000 or refinance it for $300,000. You had an extra $100,000 that you could go spend. So actually the consumption in the United States from about 2001 onwards was bolstered by a huge amount of refinancing of mortgages on the part of relatively low-income populations. When that crashed, then of course the consumption in the United States fell off very fast. Now, who provides the goods for the American consumer market? Well, it's heavily, of course, the Chinese. So suddenly the Chinese export market goes crash. And the stories that came out of China at the beginning of 2009 was that China had lost something like 30 million jobs in a few months because of the crash of the export market. 30 million. That's huge. But then something interesting happened, because by the end of the year there were sophisticated reports on, what the net job losses have been because of what happened in 2008. And in China, the net job loss was recorded as around 3 million, which means that somehow or other the Chinese created 27 million jobs in 9 months, which is an absolutely astonishing performance. How did they do that? How did they take surplus capital and surplus labor and put it back to work? Guess what they did? They built new cities. They did an urbanization project which was huge. And like the United States, they also rebalanced the regional economy. They said, we have very good cities on the coast, we don't have any in the interior. Let's build cities in the interior. Let's build high-speed networks. Like the interstate highway system the United States built, let's build high-speed networks, rail networks, road networks. Let's build dams, let's build infrastructure. And it's estimated that over the last 5 years, about 25% of Chinese growth, which has been very strong, and the only real big center of counter-growth to the recession, but 25% of that growth was taken up simply with the production of housing and speculation in the housing market. And if you add to that 25% all of the infrastructure investments, probably about half of Chinese growth these last 5-10 years has been taken up with an urbanization project. In other words, this is what Haussmann did in Paris in the 1950s, what Robert Moses did with New York metropolitan region in the 1950s. The Chinese are doing it at a scale which is unprecedented, which is dramatic. But then if you look around and say, what has been happening in cities? Actually, not only in China, but in many parts of the world where there's been growth. Here in Brazil, what do I see? I look across there, what do I see? I go to Turkey, what do I see? A very, very dynamic economy which is absolutely crazy about rebuilding the cities and creating new urban infrastructures. So that actually globally, what we've got into is a process of what we might call planetary urbanization. But it's a planetary urbanization that's driven by this necessity to find a market and to find something to do in a situation where things are rather tight in terms of profit opportunities. In other words, urbanization has moved from being a minor part of what the dynamic of capital is about to being central to the reproduction of capital. The Chinese urbanization project was the only one that really got the global economy out of its difficulties after 2007, 2008. And that urbanization project put huge demands on raw materials. So it's the Chinese demand for raw materials which has actually done extremely well for countries like Chile with copper, Australia with a lot of iron ore and other minerals and coal. So all of those countries which were supplying China with the raw materials needed to build the cities did reasonably well and came out of the crisis fairly quickly. So this notion of urbanization has various layers. For instance, one of the responses here in Brazil, as I recall, to the crisis condition was Lula kind of saying, we're going to build 1 million new houses somewhere. In other words, we get out of the difficulties by an urbanization project. How do you do that? Well, you do it by debt financing, and you do it again by financialization. Now, this is, if you like, the way in which cities are being built and rebuilt. What kind of city does capital like to build? It likes to build for the high profit margin urbanization, which means it loves mega projects. It particularly loves mega projects which are funded as public-private partnerships. And public-private partnerships have an interesting characteristic in that they tend to mean that the public takes all of the risks and the private takes all of the profit. And I think that, so it does, capital loves that sort of thing. Now, I always thought that capital was supposed to be about risky investments, and if you lost, you lost. We have increasingly a capital that doesn't want to lose anything. It says, guarantee us a rate of return. We'll manage your water supply, but you guarantee us an 8% rate of return on our capital, and we'll do something with your water supply. Maybe you'll get some water, maybe you won't. So this is, if you like, one of the processes. They also like to build condominiums for the very rich. And the very rich like to buy condominiums, not necessarily to live in, but as investments. So they speculate. We have a lot of condominiums in New York City that are not lived in. We have a crisis of affordable housing for the mass of the population. But we have a surplus of condominiums for the ultra-rich. Who buys them? Well, Saudi investors, Russian investors, rich people from anywhere kind of feel it's a good place to park your money is to have a condominium in a very rich area in New York City. But it's not only happening in New York City. I see it happening in London, I see it happening in Istanbul, I see it happening everywhere, that property prices are surging, going through the roof in all of the major cities around the world. In other words, there is an urbanization project, a kind of urbanization that's emerging out of the requirements of capital. Now, one of the responses is to produce a great deal of discontent on the part of the mass of the population. That discontent, of course, is driven by the fact that most of the population now cannot afford to live in the cities where they dwell. Their prices are so high, the rental structure is such that people cannot afford to find space in the city in which they live. In New York City, for example, the top 1% incomes, according to the income tax returns of 2012, in that year, the top 1% on average earned $3.57 million a year. 50% of the population of New York City tries to live on less than $30,000 a year. Now, if you're living on $30,000 a year, you can afford, at most, to pay just around, at most, $1,000 a month rent. Try finding any accommodation within the whole New York metropolitan region for less than $1,000 a month. You won't find it anywhere. Some people are spending something like 80% of their income on rent alone, and then trying, I don't know, how to steal food from a supermarket, or dumpster diving, as we call it, going and hauling it out of the trash. And this in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. The result is there's a profound alienation with the qualities of urban life. And the result is, I think, a pattern of urban unrest emerging. Sometimes localized, of the sort we were looking at yesterday, but sometimes it erupts into something much bigger. I mean, what were the protests in Brazil about last year? Well, they were about many things. Transport costs, spending all this money on mega projects, and so on. But underneath it, there lay a profound discontent with the qualities of urban life, qualities of daily living in the city. That the city does not function effectively for the mass of the population. And how do you make it function effectively when capital insists on doing this, doing this, doing this, when capital controls so much political power, when capital controls so much of the media? How do you do this? And we see the same thing happened in Turkey around the same time that you had your explosion. A simple, small protest about cutting down some trees in Gezi Park to make way for a supermarket. Suddenly the police get involved, suddenly everybody's on the street, suddenly thousands of people are all disrupting the city, and it's not only Istanbul, it's also in Ankara, Izmir, all of the other urban system. In other words, there's a generalized protest throughout the urban system about lack of democracy, about lack of consultation, about lack of building a city which is effective for the population, as opposed to being effective for the profiteering of finance capital and the developers. And we know that's the situation. And we find that will be the same situation in New York City, the same situation in London, the same situation in Santiago, in Chile. I do some work in Quito now. It's the same situation in Quito. With a lot of those buildings which the capitalists love to build actually empty of people. It's a good exercise in New York City to go around and see how many of these very tall buildings, very affluent buildings, have lights on at 8 o'clock at night. And actually you can find buildings where there's no lights on at all. All the units are sold. Nobody's living in any of them. They're all simply bought for speculative purposes. Now, what kind of crazy, insane situation is this? where massive resources are being taken up in building cities in which actually most people are not able to live. This is insane. And when I say I'm anti-capitalist because I think I'm sane, it's irrational in the extreme. And the only rational way out of it is to say, stop capital building cities in the way it does. Let's find a way for there to be popular forces mobilized around building the city which meets the needs of the people, as opposed to meeting the needs of capital accumulation. And this is the rational way in which to go. But the problem is this, that if we take away the capacity of capital to actually use cities to accumulate more wealth and power, where will it go? Actually, it's going to have a hard time finding anything to do. Except, of course, invent new markets about strange things. So, this is, if you like, the crisis situation. That capital accumulation forever, compounding growth, is going to transform cities radically. Now, when I visited Recife in 1973, you saw none of this that you see over here. People were living by the beach, ordinary small houses. It was kind of an interesting place to be, had distinctive cultural form. And I was only here for a few days, but I had a very interesting impression of it. Then I come back and I look at what has been made over the last 40 years. And then I would say to you, imagine that that was just the beginning of a compounding growth process. Imagine what compounding on all of that is going to mean over the next 40 years. Can you imagine what kind of world you'll be living in? Can you imagine what's going to happen? The huge pressures which are now being exerted by the real estate interest to capture cities and do what they want with them is simply a last act of desperation on the part of capital to reproduce itself. Now, capital has given us a lot of very, very great things in new technologies, new capacities and powers. Our task, it seems to me, is to utilize those great things which capital has created and say, thank you very much, ciao. It's time to be gone. And we can take over all of those wonderful things that have been created, those wonderful capacities and powers, and mobilize them around the popular people. And at the same time as we're doing that, we can address what seem to me to be the mass discontents that are now being expressed on the streets around the global cities. How many massive global protests have there been, massive urban protests have there been around the globe over the last 30 years? More and more we've seen cities erupting. London exploded, Paris exploded, Stockholm exploded. We see these explosions of discontent. But the explosions of discontent have to come together around a solid process which says, let's be anti-capitalist, let us think about the rational organization of urban life, let us think about ways of producing and realizing values for each other through a radical program of reconstruction of the economic system. That's what we have to look to. But that is not what most people are thinking about. And that's, I think, what I would like you to think about. So thank you very much.
Vamos agradecer ao professor Harvey, né, pela sua brilhante palestra, sua brilhante conferência. E como nós temos pouco tempo para perguntas, nós vamos abrir questões que serão abertas ao público, mas de uma forma escrita, tá certo? Então, vocês redigem a pergunta, passam para a pessoa do cerimonial, que entrega a mesa, e a mesa passa para o professor Harvey. Você tem mais alguma coisa? A sugestão que a gente faz é que vocês façam perguntas com objetividade e pouco alongadas, né? E que estejam diretamente vinculadas ao discurso que foi elaborado pelo professor Harvey. Eu estou muito satisfeita em ter ouvido da parte do professor Harvey exatamente aquilo que nós queríamos ouvir, né? E como nos mover enquanto acadêmicos. A maior parte das pessoas que estão aqui são acadêmicas das universidades, estudantes, professores, técnicos, etc. Como pensar, né, o nosso movimento enquanto acadêmico na nossa prática cotidiana. Então, eu acho que essa é a direção que deve ser dada. Como pensar a cidade, como pensar a urbanização das cidades, das nossas cidades, numa nova direção, num novo momento político, nacional e internacional. Como trazer para as pessoas o direito à habitação, o direito à cidade. Bom, então a gente abre a palavra agora para as pessoas e de forma escrita para facilitar o discurso.
Bom, a gente teve algumas perguntas aqui, a gente vai fazer um primeiro bloco, então. A primeira é: qual é a avaliação que o senhor faz dos processos de reestruturação urbana impulsionadas pelos megaeventos, concessões internacionais, Copa do Mundo, Olimpíadas, enquanto nosso padrão de acumulação de capital, como ocorreu com Barcelona e que hoje acontece no Brasil, particularmente Rio de Janeiro? Uma segunda questão: o problema das cidades hoje não é o superadensamento populacional, concentração excessiva da população? E uma última aqui, para não ficar muito. Dentro do que foi exposto, como pensar a arquitetura contemporânea e os inúmeros centros culturais, museus e lugares de reunião das pessoas? São elas parte do mesmo processo de acumulação de capital?
Yeah, there's also a problem, also a question about degrowth and Ivan Illich. One of the things I didn't have time to mention is that one of the responses of capital to this dynamic problem of perpetual accumulation has been to accelerate turnover times, that is, to speed things up. It speeds up in the realm of production, but it also has to speed up in the realm of consumption. Now, I'd like to mention that I still use my grandmother's knives and forks, which is a very, very slow turnover time in consumption. If capital only produced things that lasted 100 years, it would have gone out of business a long time ago. So it tends to build things that fall apart. It tends to mobilize fashion so that things become unfashionable. It tends to seek out forms of consumption that are short-lived. And one of the most dramatic things I think that's happened is that it likes to spend a lot of time producing spectacle, because the spectacle is instantaneously consumed. So one of the things that has happened is that sites for the production of spectacles become more and more part of what capital is about. so that museums and cultural events and cultural centers, but also, of course, great sports events and so on, become absolutely central to what capital is about, and the spectacle becomes more and more elaborate. I like to suggest to my students that they go back and look at the films of the opening ceremonies of Olympic Games, and look at what they were like in 1960 and look at what they have become over time. They become more and more spectacular, and you're going to have an interesting time in a year or two in terms of what kind of spectacle are you going to lay on that competes with that of China and the rest of it. Now, one of the things that has happened, by the way, with Olympic Games, which I think is very important to remember, is that almost all cities that have staged Olympic Games have either run into financial difficulties afterwards or have gone bankrupt. In fact, in the case of Greece, the whole country went bankrupt. So Brazil, watch out. But the thing, like I say, about spectacle is its rapid turnover. And urbanization has been very much about, more and more about the mobilization of spectacle. So that every municipal administration looks for a cultural festival or a film festival or get a new art museum or something, just to keep the consumerism turning over. Now, I'm not against some spectacles. I love to watch soccer, I confess. But I think that when we look at the economics of it, what we see is an economic process that is becoming more and more obnoxious, more and more capital intensive, and more capital absorbing. And I think that this is therefore taking of resources away from, again, something that should be dedicated to improving the quality of daily life, to creating some sort of huge spectacle. Now, degrowth. There have been many people who've been talking about reducing growth. Ivan Illich was one of them, Schumacher, small is beautiful. One of the problems, however, we have right now is that there are many segments of the left who are anti-growth and who are seeking to construct alternative economies like solidarity economies, local economies. And I'm very supportive of those initiatives. But at the same time, there is a difficulty of taking these small initiatives and building them up. What we geographers call jumping scale, from the local scale to a metropolitan scale to a global scale. How do we actually coordinate our activities in some way? And very frequently, the degrowth is about a local, creating a local economy which is as self-subsistent as possible. But that doesn't actually make sense at the global scale. Lots of small communes producing their own value in their own particular way would be highly vulnerable to the local famines and local starvation. And again, we have to build upon that which capital has created in a constructive way, rather than simply rejecting, I think, some of those aspects of the capitalist dynamic which need to be preserved. So while I think it's great that we should be degrowth, I think how we are degrowth is going to become a very critical question, and we cannot do that simply by retreating into the locality as the center of what we do and of how we survive. We need to mobilize the locality. I think that's always crucial, but the locality has to actually then link it to other localities in a way which will make sense from, say, the whole metropolitan region of Recife, rather than from the standpoint of local neighborhoods, and not only Recife, but at some point or other, the whole urban system that structures Brazil, Latin America, and now is part of a global network. I have a fantasy sometimes about, in the same way that capital originated by merchant capitalist cities linking together throughout Europe and creating something called the Hanseatic League of Commerce, that maybe one day we will have a league of socialist cities, which will actually sort of support each other rather than compete with each other, which will actually, through their links, become much greater than the sum of their parts and create a new kind of society, a new kind of civilization by mobilizing the urban network in ways which we've seen being mobilized. I mean, here in Brazil or in Turkey just in the last couple of years, it was the whole urban network that was involved in the protests. The whole urban network was expressing something about the global situation, and that seems to me to be something which has some very hopeful signs in what we might be able to do. I remember in particular, just as another example, perhaps the best example in recent times, was February the 15th, 2003, when there was a global protest against the prospect of war with Iraq, when in fact there were 2 million people in Madrid, 2 million people in Rome, 1 million or more in London, 1 million possibly in New York City, all of them protesting against, simultaneously protesting against the prospect of a war. Now that movement erupted, was very big, and then disappeared. But one of the things I sometimes wonder is what will happen when all those people who turn out on the street, as they did on February the 15th, 2003, remain on the street until there's significant change. Then we might see actually a global social movement of some kind which is networked through the urban system, which will have a big impact upon the political situation.
Bom, a gente tem um número muito grande de perguntas, então a gente separou elas em blocos temáticos. Muitas das perguntas tecem indagações sobre a questão do Estado nisso tudo. Então tem perguntas sobre há espaço para além de ocupar as ruas para planejamento progressivo no interior do Estado? Como você enxerga o papel do ativismo judicial, o papel dos partidos políticos e a questão da corrupção nisso tudo?
I think it's the case that the state has increasingly become captive of capitalist class interests. There's a famous phrase from Marx that says the state is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. I don't think that's ever been quite true, and it's still not fully true, but it's probably truer now than it's been for a very long time. Now, there are many parts of the world where the state is still subject to popular will and popular forces, and we have popularly elected governments which don't entirely respond to the will of capital. They negotiate with capital in certain ways, often cave in to the power of capital, but on other issues go against the power of capital. So I think the state is a terribly important institution. I think that politics has to be dedicated in part to the transformation of the capitalist state into a different kind of state. But the state is not monolithic. There are always segments of the state which are different from others, and levels of state power, can be municipality or regional or whatever, which are more open to citizen influence and citizen participation. For example, in the United States, the federal government refuses to raise the minimum wage. So a movement has occurred amongst municipalities to start to pass ordinances at the local level saying that we have to pay a living wage, which is much higher than the federal minimum wage. And we now have something like 200 or 300 municipalities that have actually raised the wage by these means, and this is going stronger and stronger and stronger, so that there are ways in which the state can be used. Sometimes you use the local state against the federal state, sometimes you use the federal state against the local state. It depends. I don't share the view of many people that the state is always the problem. The state is sometimes the problem, and sometimes it's necessary to go against state power by being on the street. But I think that also there are times when I think the left should be more sophisticated and seek to subvert the state to its own purposes rather than to smash the state. There's a certain kind of incoherence of left thinking on this. I was amused by the last book by Tony Negri and Michael Hart, in which I think it was on page 300, they smashed the state. And then about 20 pages later, they demanded that the state provide universal income guarantees, universal health care, and universal education. And I said, well, you know, how the hell do you have the state provide that when you just smashed it on page 300, you know? So you kind of go, you know, be careful what you say about the state, because also my radical friends get very annoyed at me, who are particularly those who are anti-state, and I say, who said the state is not the solution, the state is the problem? Well, it was Ronald Reagan. So I kind of accuse a lot of my left friends of being Reaganites, and they get very upset. But you see the point, that actually the right wing is as antagonistic to the state in many instances as people on the left. And I think that I'm sort of kind of saying you need something like the state in order to survive, and in order to deal with many of the issues that arise around things like, I don't know, the allocation of water resources, which is a big issue in many parts of the world. You need a form of organization around that which is democratic, but at the same time looks a little bit like a state apparatus, which is going to manage the provision of water, is going to conserve water resources in an adequate kind of way. So some decision-making structure has to be created of that kind, which can't be regulated simply by a local commune. It has to be a much more broader kind of issue. And there are many regional and global issues of this kind that require some sort of collective management. And I'm very much in favor of starting to think not so much about the state as to think about the commons, what we call the commons, and then to think about institutions through which the commons could be managed collectively. And of course many people would argue that it's best managed through assembly forms of discussion, but assemblies work very well for certain issues, but don't work so well for others. So we have to be flexible in terms of the sorts of organizational forms we construct and advocate for, and not be entirely dismissive of that organizational form because it is hierarchical or because it's large scale or something of that kind. So I think we need a good deal of thinking about the institutional structures that would be adequate to the construction of an alternative to what capital accumulation is about. Actually, we already have many collaborative structures which exist. Yesterday, I often get faced with the idea you can't stop human beings being competitive. And therefore, you know, all of this stuff you have about collaboration and mutual aid is kind of pie in the sky. And I said, have you looked at how air traffic control systems work? How would you like to fly on an airline system where one airliner is trying to beat the other airliner to the ground? How would you like to live in a world like that? And the answer is there are structures of collaboration and cooperation. all over the place right now. And we can expand those and I think develop them in very sophisticated ways so that they actually carry over to the management, a much more adequate management of many of the assets we need to live a decent life in a decent living environment.
Essas três questões se dirigem à relação entre capitalismo, meio ambiente, sustentabilidade e natureza. Como compatibilizar dentro do capitalismo esta sustentabilidade? É possível ou não é possível? A relação entre a sustentabilidade ambiental, a sustentabilidade social, a sustentabilidade do próprio meio ambiente dentro de um sistema de exploração baseado na acumulação do capital.
I'm sorry, I tend to dislike the term sustainability. I dislike it because it just means anything you want. And it's a term that makes everybody happy, but it doesn't necessarily have any real content. The relation to nature question. I've just written a book called 17 Contradictions in the End of Capitalism, which will be published by Boitempo next year. And I list some dangerous contradictions at the end. There are three dangerous contradictions. One of them is the perpetual growth contradiction that I've already talked about today. The second is the environmental issue. Marx was very reluctant to accord any power to the idea of environmental limits. And he was reluctant for good reason. For instance, the definition of a resource is not given by nature. The definition of a resource is fixed by technical, social, cultural, and economic conditions. So if there's a shortage of a resource, then Marx, I think, would argue that the way out of that scarcity or the way out of that shortage is to change our culture, to change our economic form, to change our technology, and to change our political system. And actually, capital has been pretty sophisticated in its capacity to bypass and move through environmental contradictions. But I think the room for maneuver is much more restricted now than it has been before. And I think that the only way we can start to worry about the environmental question is not so much in terms of scarcity, but it almost becomes an aesthetic question of how do we feel about our relation to the natural world around us. And that feeds into the third contradiction that I talk about, which is what I consider to be mass alienation. That the satisfaction to be had from doing a job is less and less prominent in people's lives. The jobs we take on are, for the most part, more and more meaningless. They have less and less content. And this is even true for industrial labor. The biggest employers of labor in the United States in 1970 were General Motors, Ford, and US Steel. And if you talk to a steel worker, they would understand the conditions of their own exploitation. But they would also have a certain pride in their work, a certain pride that they were tough people, people who could actually, do the hot, sweaty job of making steel. The biggest employers of labor now are Walmart, as a retail store, which I think doesn't actually provide meaningful jobs to anybody. McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken. Now, maybe some people get some sense of pride out of making Kentucky Fried Chicken. I don't know. I haven't encountered any. By and large, people enter into this work in a precarious way and get out of it as fast as they can. The same is true of McDonald's. So the jobs around us are of that quality. And we also have a situation of what we might call compensatory consumerism. That is a kind of a system that says, okay, you have a lousy, meaningless job, but you can get meaning out of consumption. But actually it turns out that a lot of the consumption is pretty meaningless too. And people feel it. What's the point? Consumerism just becomes kind of pretty empty, because consumerism is always about the unfulfillment of desire, because the only way consumerism can work is always to leave you with unfilled desire, so you need more. And at a certain point people kind of say, I'm fed up with it. So there's compensatory consumerism, and maybe there are good forms of tourism or something like that that give meaning to people's lives, but this is a very difficult sort of topic. So these three issues of consumerism, of alienation, mass alienation, relation to nature, and perpetual growth seem to me to be the core of what contemporary discontents are about. And I think the environmental issue is partly a technical kind of problem, and capital is attempting to portray itself as having answers to the environmental issue by new environmentally friendly technologies, some of which is actually the case, but a lot of which is just sort of public relations. So we have some serious issues, and putting those three together, perpetual growth, environmental difficulties and confusions, and mass alienation, I think you have the core of what the main discontents are in contemporary society, which were not the same as those which Marx faced. And I think we have to look at those and say, this is the fulcrum of where social and political change is going to come from. And I'm convinced that this whole kind of question of the relation to nature is a big issue and is becoming even bigger as time goes on.
A gente tem outro bloco sobre a transição ao socialismo, ou comunismo, enfim. Por que usar o termo anticapitalismo e não comunismo, socialismo? Você acha que o capitalismo está se decompondo? Ou, por outro lado, a gente vê o tempo todo a capacidade que o capitalismo tem de se reinventar? E como aproveitar todos os frutos do desenvolvimento tecnológico capitalista e dizer tchau aos capitalistas?
I don't mind if you want to call it communism or socialism. I think, Marx was very reluctant to talk about what a communist society would look like. He had some ideas about possibilities, but never turned out a blueprint. I think part of the problem with those terms like socialism and communism is that people think they know what they mean by them, but actually there's this problem of how can we possibly know what they mean until we've actually made them. My analogy here would be, suppose you were interviewing a medieval monk in late feudalism, and you ask the medieval monk to describe what capitalism would be like. Wouldn't have the faintest idea how to reply. I feel a bit like a medieval monk, except that I'm in capitalism. And you ask me what socialism or communism would be like, and I really have no idea. And I think the problem with socialism and communism is that people do have an idea. And that idea is often profoundly misleading and in some cases downright reactionary. Marx, I think, held to the idea that the alternative to where we're at now is actually already present around us. I think of this in the following way. The value theory upon which capital works is a certain kind of labor theory of value which is structured through market exchange and under relations of capitalist domination over labor. But there are alternative value structures which exist in society. It's long been controversial to sort of ask the question, what's the role of household labor under capitalism? Well, in my view, household labor and, in fact, the social labor we do for others on a voluntary basis is a very, very important part of our social life. And it's not only simply the household, it can also be collectivities of various kinds, people coming together and, you know, all bringing their own food and socializing around what they have made or something. So the path to an alternative society is partly by extending that realm in which we do social labor for others on a voluntary basis, without remuneration, and without actually having in mind that we're somehow or other going to gain from it. Now, it turns out there are actually quite a few labor areas emerging under capital where this kind of labor is becoming crucial. Software development, peer-to-peer computing practices are all based on people seeing a problem and collectively solving it through using their own labor to get to it without necessarily any remuneration. In fact, we're giving up a lot of labor all of the time. The problem is that our labor gets enclosed and appropriated by others. Who produces the value of Google or Facebook? We do. We are the producers. Do we get remuneration? I mean, does Google pay us, you know, a little bit every time we provide Google with the information that it then uses to sell on to others? No, we produce the value. Google appropriates it. That is fundamentally wrong. But remember, you, every time you tune into Google or Facebook, are actually producing value for Google and Facebook. Now, you get on it for social reasons. You don't get on it, you know, to make value, but you actually make value with what you do. So we live in a society where actually there are very large areas where collectively we are making the value which surrounds us. And as we do that, we're actually socializing things in certain ways. And people talk about the potentiality of the internet and all the new things that are there in terms of its social possibilities. It's true. But then the other side of it is what we're seeing is the appropriation of all of that value as a form of rent. In other words, the people who set up Google and the people who set up Amazon and who set up Facebook are filthy rich. How did they get rich? What did they do? They did nothing. They simply appropriated all our labor and turned it into a rental stream. I think that's fundamentally wrong. Should be the other way around. They should pay us for creating the value which, you know, then has social meaning. And then there's a kind of question
of what kind of social meaning that is put to, well, of course, the information they have is passed over to guess who? The advertisers, the capitalists. In other words, they suck value out of us, and then they get paid by the capitalists because they're providing fundamental information to the capitalists. So this is, if you like, the dynamic around. And then, so to me, the big thing is, how do we take these areas of social labor, which already exist, which are outside of the market, and turn them into much broader practices which are collectively set up, and which are collectively set up in such a way as to realize new possibilities in terms of the creation of social meaning for each other. Now, how this will all work out down the line and what kind of society it will end up producing, I have no idea. So I have no imaginary of what communism should look like, and I think the problem with the Soviet Union was, I think, it got to the point where they decided they knew what it was, and they were not going to deviate from that. And there's a lot of interesting conservatism. Marxists can be very conservative. Very conservative. I mean, it's amazing. And you kind of go, well, we should actually be the ones who are kind of running with these new possibilities. But what we see around us is a lot of this movement which came out, particularly in Turkey and Gezi Park, was led by cultural producers. It wasn't the classical working class that was in the vanguard. It was cultural producers. People who were involved in making small things, working through things, setting up cultural activities and the like. They were the ones who were first out on the street. And we're seeing a new way of doing politics, and we're seeing the emergence of a new vanguard, if you want to call it that, which is different from the classical working class. And that new vanguard has different values entirely from those which were conventionally embedded in the politics of the industrial proletariat. So we're beginning to see a new, and a lot of this I think is extremely interesting, because we are at that inflection point where capital accumulation can't continue, where cultural production is being mobilized into capital accumulation, and there's resistance within the cultural producing community, and there's a struggle going on over the production of culture and cultural life. And that struggle is actually taking political form, and I think articulating many of the discontents that exist with daily life in the city. So if we take daily life in the city as, if you like, the fulcrum of what it is that we're seeking to change, then we'll have to talk in ways which were not in the classic communism at all, because classic communism didn't take much notice of cities. What we need to do is to actually think about what would be an adequate urban life, and how to build cities in a ways that satisfy that demand for an adequate urban life.
O que aconteceu no Brasil recentemente, a crise, tanto a crise política como a crise social que nós passamos, levou o governo brasileiro, nos 12 últimos anos, o governo do Partido dos Trabalhadores, a mover algumas iniciativas no sentido de minorar as condições de vida da população mais pobre. Então, a pergunta é a viabilidade e a legitimidade da transferência de renda através do programa Bolsa Família, né? A questão do acesso aos bens de consumo que ele gerou, além do acesso à alimentação, à subsistência do cotidiano. Esse programa é amplamente criticado. O autor coloca, isso aqui não é minha opinião, tanto pela direita quanto pela esquerda brasileira. Como o senhor vê esses programas desta natureza? A outra questão se refere à política também de geração de renda através do programa Minha Casa Minha Vida, a política habitacional implantada pelo país, pelo governo brasileiro, visando também a geração de emprego e renda e de qualidade de vida à população. As outras duas questões dizem respeito a Recife, ao comportamento do mercado. Eu acho que o professor já falou durante a sua conferência sobre o mercado imobiliário de uma forma geral, né? Como é que o boom imobiliário se portou nos Estados Unidos e a trajetória desse mercado no mundo inteiro e a lógica desse capital nas cidades. Então, a pergunta é sobre a questão desse mercado em Recife, crescendo em escala acelerada nos últimos 10 anos. Como é que essa aceleração, quer dizer, nós estamos também diante de nosso cotidiano, vivenciando ao mesmo que se vivencia em Nova York. Prédios fechados, capitalistas investindo. É muito interessante porque tem migrações de capital, de pessoas que moram no interior do estado para adquirir apartamentos aqui através de investimentos e que deixam os imóveis fechados e vão embora. Ficam morando lá no interior e o apartamento fica, quer dizer, no meu ponto de vista, há uma certa lavagem de dinheiro. É isso que coloca aqui Então, Recife está sendo estrangulada, né, por essa forma de acumulação e com políticas urbanísticas com alto grau elevado, né, de empresariamento da cidade. Como ver esse crescimento dessa forma e como podemos reestruturar a cidade para uma melhor qualidade de vida. E, finalmente, a questão dos movimentos sociais, que eu acho que também ele já mencionou, quer dizer, qual o papel dos movimentos sociais nessa transição de acumulação e crise permanente que vive o mundo de hoje. Quer dizer, você tem crises frequentes do capital e, ao mesmo tempo, cíclicos, né, de geração de processos de acumulação cada vez mais intensivos e intensos, e em algumas regiões e em outras não. As periferias, né, os países africanos, os países que estão sendo motivo, né, da acumulação e, ao mesmo tempo, sendo expropriados na sua capacidade de subsistência e de manutenção de qualidade de vida. Bom, se a gente não deu a impressão que todos queriam, a gente faculta alguém que queira mencionar alguma coisa, mas essas são as últimas questões que nos foram colocadas. Obrigado.
It's always very difficult to comment on conditions in a country that I don't know that well. I mean, I travel here some, but I'm not an expert on Brazil, and I'm certainly not an expert on Recife, although I've been here 2 days, maybe 3 days, so perhaps I am an expert. But I think the question of the social movements, currently the social movements are, I think, changing somewhat. If we look back at the alternative globalization movement and the first meetings in Porto Alegre, there was an interest in coming together on a global basis of many different currents of thought. And the World Social Forum attempted, I think, to suggest that there was room for global discussions over what to do about the effects of globalization, how to confront the impacts of financialization. And I think there was an interest in communicating between people in different countries. Over time, of course, the World Social Forum dissolved a bit into regional forums where some of the regional actors preferred to operate. But in many ways, I think the World Social Forum has not produced what I think many people hoped it would be produced, which would be a global movement of some kind with a certain kind of global coherence. This had a lot to do with the fact that there was a reluctance on the part of the global forums to consider themselves as, quote, policy making or strategy making. They saw themselves, in terms of their leadership, very much about questions of communication of information. Well, we now have structures of communication and information through the internet, which are far more developed now than they were back then, which allows organizations like Via Campesina, or increasingly, say, right to the city groups and groupings to come together in a very, very distinctive way. But the main feature, I think, of the active side of the social movements has been to be ephemeral. That is, the movements come and go. They rise and they fall very quickly. On their rise, they can be extremely active, and then they fade away. I think that the protests here in Brazil rose and crested and faded away. The same was true in Turkey. But they leave behind a residual of, well, you know, what can we do and how can we do it more effectively? The movements are not only ephemeral, but they're also frequently fragmented. So we face a global protest movement that lacks any kind of continuous organizational form. And this, I think, needs to be addressed, if not remedied in some way, by creating not only better links between the movements, because, like I've said, we see a lot of those links constantly being articulated through the internet and through internet traffic, but to find a way to convert the conversation that goes on through the internet into political action. And interestingly, I think we have to recognize that people on the streets, bodies on the streets, are at some point or other the only form of action which really works and which really matters. So that the internet become a facilitator, but it can't be, if you like, the revolutionary vehicle for social change. At the same time, there is also a great deal of organization in civil society, which is articulated through the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs. Now, the non-governmental organizations are essentially a privatized attempt to deal with many of the world's social, environmental, and political problems. But all of the NGOs are very beholden to who it is that gives them money. And of course, the money givers are essentially the ultra-rich. So there's a sense in which the NGOs are vehicles and to in many senses, capitalist instruments. Not directly in many cases, but certainly subject to regulation by the people who provide the money. my own experience with NGOs has been to suggest some programs, and the officers in the NGOs all love what I have to propose, but they all say the same thing. There's no way our board would ever approve what it is you're proposing. And I say, why not? And he said, well, because it goes against their interest. And I kind of end up saying, well, let us suppose that all of those organizations which exist, which are attempting to deal with the problem of global poverty, and there are millions of people involved in this. Let's suppose all of those organizations suddenly changed their character and they became anti the accumulation of wealth. What kind of world would we be in? I mean, that would be a huge political movement, but of course, it's impossible. But this then leads into the impossibility that it is impossible to solve the problem of the production of global poverty without solving the problem of the accumulation of global wealth. Because global wealth is actually wealth which is accumulated on the basis of global poverty. So you can't solve one question without solving the other. But all of the NGOs are given over to solving the problem of global poverty without touching in any way the production of global wealth and accumulation of global wealth by an increasingly narrower oligarchy of political and economic power. So the social movements have, it seems to me, have a character which is often affected by that NGO structure. They have to find ways, I think, to get round it somehow. And at the same time, we need social movements which are free of the influence of NGOs. And I think to some degree, what might be called the end of the World Social Forum movement really came with the degree to which the World Social Forum movement was taken over by the NGO interests. And as soon as it became actually captive to the NGOs, then it seemed to me it lost a lot of its political impetus and a lot of its political verve. So there are a lot of problems of organization on the left, and I know that I'm talking strictly about that and not about some of the other specific issues which are raised in the Brazilian context. But like I say, I'm very reluctant to comment too much about the situation in Brazil. You live here, you know the situation better than I do, and it's up to you to sort out if there are problems and to identify the problems, and you should tell me. So that's the kind of thing I come here to learn about, rather than come and lecture you about. You know, you're smart people, you should know what to do, and you should tell me how you're going to do it. Thanks very much.